Welcome to the first ever book awards from Books and Big Ideas, where I rant about my favorite books from 2023. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. Alright, I've never done this before, but I thought it'd be fun to put together just a compilation of comments on my favorite books from the year 2023. So I'll give a little bit of an overview of kind of how I categorized books and how I picked them, and then we'll dive in. So this is going to be fun. Okay, so first of all the books I'm going to mention are books that were published in 2023. I read about 135 books last year as I record this. I'm recording this in January of 2024. Read about 135 books. They were not all by any means published in 2023, but a lot of them were. And I wanted to feature books that were published in 2023 in this video. And so what I want to do is I want to comment on, I just have one fiction book I want to feature. I have two kind of surprise books that I wasn't necessarily expecting to like as much as I did. And I want to mention them. And then for the primary kind of genres that I read, especially if you follow this channel, you'll know this. I read a lot of history, nonfiction history, and a lot of what I'm calling culture or cultural studies. I read a lot of books on culture. And that's just a huge interest of mine as well. And so I want to feature 3 books in each of those categories: 3 books on history, 3 books on culture, and then 1 final book of the year. So that's kind of where I'm going. I don't know if I'll stick with these categories if I do this again next year, or I'm not sure. This is kind of all a big experiment, but I just thought this would be fun, and it might be a helpful kind of resource too if you're trying to figure out some books that came out last year that you maybe missed or that you'd like to look up, get back into. I don't know. But if you follow my videos, you probably would be interested in the stuff I'm going to talk about here. So first, my fiction pick. I do read a good bit of fiction. I enjoy fiction. I don't read probably as much of it as I would like. I definitely don't read as much of it as I read of nonfiction. But nevertheless, I do try to regularly read fiction. And my favorite book of fiction that I read that was published in 2023 was Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. I really adored this book. I just kind of fell into it and got absorbed by it. And I actually was not... I was obviously familiar with Barbara Kingsolver because she's such a well-known writer, but I had never read anything by her before, so this was my first book of hers, and I found it remarkable. It's a retelling of the famous story David Copperfield, kind of retold and reset in essentially what is current-day Appalachian America. Things like the opioid epidemic and socioeconomic realities and systemic issues factor largely into the setting. And I thought all that stuff was brilliant, but really what drew me into this was the characterization of it. The page-for-page writing style was so wonderful, and the characterization was so vivid that I just found myself empathizing, deeply emotionally engaged with the plight, particularly of Demon, the main character. And I also grew up kind of adjacent or essentially kind of near the Appalachian kind of culture and cultural region of the country, and so I had maybe some personal connections to some of that with extended family and whatnot, so maybe that factored into it as well. But more than anything, I just found the characters portrayed so vividly and so engagingly, and the plotting was paced really well without being like too fast or too slow. The plot reveals were excellent and turns were gripping, and importantly, I thought the ending was wonderful. I thought the ending was really just wonderful, and it's not something that books like this don't always stick the landing. It seems to me, and I thought this one did. So loved Demon Copperhead. I would highly recommend it for anyone who's interested in fiction, especially fiction of more of a literary kind of bent. So that's my fiction pick for the year. Next on to my surprises. I have 2 books I want to feature as surprises. One of them I did a video review for, so I'll start with there, which is A Body of Praise by David Taylor. This book was a wonderful little study of kind of the physicality of our bodies in worship. And that, even as I articulate that theme, that was just not a book I thought I would be interested in per se, or thought I needed. But even beyond that, even when I saw what it was about, I had ideas about what it was about, and it ended up surprising me even even with those ideas in mind. So it really is a wide-ranging study, also super short, super engaging, super easy to read, very rooted in church history in ways that surprised me, also comprehensive in ways that surprised me, talking about things like smells and colors and lots beyond just the physicality of our stances, like physical stances in gathered worship on Sundays, which is kind of what I brought to the book. There's so much more going on in that book. I thought it was really insightful, very niche, very unique, but very, very, very helpful. So that's a body of praise. Really enjoyed that book. Another surprise, this might be coming from way out of left field, is a book called MCU. I believe the subtitle is The Reign of Marvel Studios. Yeah, it's funny to me that I'm featuring this book. This is so not the type of book I would typically talk about, but I just ripped into this book. I picked it up. I actually, to be honest, I'm not exactly sure why I picked it up. I heard it commented on, and it intrigued me enough that I thought, okay, I'll give this one a shot. And I do occasionally enjoy a book about a corporation or a company or a business. There was a great book called Creativity Inc. that was about Pixar, for example. I really enjoyed that book. I occasionally dip into books like that, and this is essentially that kind of book about Marvel Studios, about Kevin Feige, how he put together what turned into this cultural juggernaut. And I picked this book up. I have been a lifelong kind of comic book fan. I've always enjoyed comics even growing up. And I was, past tense, was a huge fan of the MCU up through essentially the whole Thanos Infinity War saga. I saw not quite all of them, but I saw almost all those all those movies in that run in theaters. Really, 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 really into it. And then, like a lot of people, I think I just kind of jumped off the bandwagon after that whole saga was completed. Just got really, really disillusioned with it, really bored with it, really tired of trying to keep up with it, all of that. All that to say, wow, this book was so fun to read. If you're like me, if you were a fan of those MCU movies, if you were a fan of that stretch of movies, this book is just packed with so many fun anecdotes, so many interesting insights into how the business got put together, business maneuvering, deals that were made, how certain actors were landed on, how actors and directors did or did not get along, how certain figures worked with Kevin Feige or had difficulty working with him, and really his masterminding of the whole kind of situation. And then it also just gives you this like really wild kind of sense of how this thing was such an unknown risk in the late 90s into the early 2000s. It was just this, like, the fact that was like completely an unknown thing, and then how much of a cultural force it's become. It's really a pretty amazing story, and it's just packed with all these just fun little anecdotes along the way, and fun little insights, fun little glimpses into how the business of the MCU worked and became what it became. So yeah, just a ton of fun. I was really surprised. Even given my kind of background on the MCU, I still was like, am I really going to like this book? And I just kind of couldn't put it down. I just found it so fun to just dive through. So yeah, that's MCU. That's my second surprise of the year. Let's move on now to my history category. I read a lot of history. It's one of my primary interests as a reader. So I have 3 titles I want to feature here, some of which I've featured on this channel, so they probably won't be very surprising to you if you've watched any of my previous videos this year. But yeah, there's 3 titles I want to talk about. The first one is this book that I most recently reviewed called The Other Evangelicals by Isaac Sharp. I talked a lot about it in my review. I'll keep my comments short, but this was I thought, a remarkable book of history that seriously validated some things that I had been kind of wondering about for a long time. It also challenged some things that I had previously held before reading the book. It stretched my thinking. There's still some historical judgments in the book that I'm not sure if I'm totally on board with yet, and there are certainly missing parts of the story that are not in this book that I wish were there. But that all being said, it's just an extremely well-written, provocative, bold book that really puts some language to some things that I do think are true, and I do resonate with really deeply when it comes to the story of how evangelicalism has kind of unfolded as a movement in recent American history, and also who gets to define that and where those boundaries exist. who can and cannot cross those boundaries, and who even upholds them. Man, this book has a lot of insightful things to say on all those questions. So if you're someone who has any sort of interest in American religious history, but also if you have any sort of soul searching like I do on whether or not you're evangelical or how to use that word or what the history of that word looks like, and man, Isaac Sharp's book is really, really excellent. So that's my first pick for history. The second one I want to talk about is another one I featured on this channel, so I'll keep this brief as well. But The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism by Dan Hummel is another remarkable book of history. It's much more specific than Isaac Sharp's book. It, as the title implies, it charts the growth and cultural power and then decline of a movement, a theological movement known as dispensationalism, which is very specific, but has had remarkable impact and power in the American cultural and religious landscape. Not just religious landscape, but the broader cultural landscape, which is part of what he goes into. And this is just, if you grew up in any sort of fundamentalistic or dispensational or adjacent to any sort of dispensational setting, church, denomination, school or multiple schools, I think you would love this book because he charts the history, how the key movers and shakers of it and shapers of the movement, the key kind of cultural moments it lived through, like things like the Civil War, things like the revivalism of the late 1800s and early 1900s, all of that. It's just such a good, even-handed, clearly written, enjoyable to read historical account that also packs some like serious explanatory power for a lot of the American religious landscape. So The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism is just outstanding. Okay, and my last history pick for the year, which I don't think I've talked about on this channel, is no, actually I did do a review of this. Now that I'm thinking about it, that's Remaking the World. So I reviewed all of these books, so I'll keep these comments short too. But Remaking the World by Andrew Wilson, published by Crossway. I also love this book. This one was, of the three history books I picked, probably this one was the most fun, just sheer fun to read. Andrew Wilson kind of puts forward a case for, he zeroes in on the year 1776, which honestly, that's a little bit more of a gimmick or maybe a little bit more of a hook. He does talk a lot about the year 1776, but really that's like a doorway into a broader historical argument he's making. But he builds on the weird acronym, Western, industrialized, educated, rich, democratic. He builds on that and adds ex-Christian and romantic. And all told, he paints a really, I think, compelling and very fun to read kind of portrait of the Western cultural landscape as we experience it now, and a really intriguing idea about 1776 being a kind of a hinge point, a historical hinge point, that a lot of events happen that year that kind of point to where we are today. Super insightful, and also, like I said, extraordinarily fun to read. So I really love that book. So that's my history category. Let's move on to my culture category, which admittedly culture is a little bit of a harder, that's kind of a squishy definer, squishy label, but nevertheless, I think that these all fit under that. So let me talk about three titles from that before I get to my overall book of the year. So the first culture book I want to feature is, this is a book that I did a review of, and I also interviewed the author. I also should mention I interviewed Dan Hummel as well on the Rise of Fall of Dispensationalism, but yeah, I interviewed Andy Root, and I really loved, to nobody's surprise, if you've watched any of my videos, I loved the most recent book he put out, in the Ministry in a Secular Age series, the Church in an Age of Secular Mysticisms. Again, reviewed it, interviewed him, won't need to go into detail here, but I find myself continually thinking about this book, especially when I read narratives, or if I read a memoir, or if I don't know, if I hear a story or a kind of a pitch about spiritual formation or transformation or anything like that, psychological kind of transformation, I think about this book, and I think especially about that triangle diagram that he lays out. I think it has so much explanatory power, so very, very helpful categories for thinking about what are the narratives we put forward about personal transformation, what do those narratives kind of imply or rely on, or what are the presuppositions under the surface that they actually kind of carry, and then how do we think about how can someone think about transformation without reference to a God, and then what does it mean on the flip side to hold to reference to the divine or the transcendent when you think about personal transformation and the role of confession and surrender and all that. Just concepts that I found so helpful, so clear. The exploration of them in this book is super fun to read, very challenging, just a really, really wonderful book. And also a book that in the Ministry and Secular Age series, this is an important point if you've read that series, this book has a very distinct kind of layer to add to that whole series. Some of the other books kind of pull off of each other, repeat things from each other, and build off of each other in certain ways. This one I find is very, very unique, has a very unique lane in the whole Ministry and Secular Age series, and I would highly recommend it if you, whether or not you've read that series, I would highly, highly recommend it if you're interested in personal transformation or especially ministry leadership. All right, the other two, I don't think I've talked about these other two books under the culture category, so the first one I want to talk about is Losing Our Religion by Russell Moore. An altar call for evangelical America, I believe is the subtitle. Man, oh man, this book resonated with me so much. It kind of reads like a long sermon. Altar call is in the subtitle, so maybe that's not a surprise, but this reads like, I was going to say a screed, but that might come off as too negative. It's not a rant, it's not a tirade, but it's a very impassioned sermon, essentially. Yeah, I mean, it feels like a sermon when you're sitting and reading through it. It is a clarion call. It's pulling on, if you know Russell Moore's background and his story and how his departure from the SBC and just all the garbage that he went through in trying to hold that institution to account for its abuses, he's pulling on some like serious experience here, and this is what I loved about it. Well, I loved a lot about it. First of all, the stuff that he critiques about the evangelical movement and the politicization of the evangelical movement, the politicization in our culture more broadly, but also the stuff he just critiques about kind of evangelicals' lust for power and fear of losing, influence in our culture. All that stuff, he just critiques it so clearly with kind of lightning bolt clarity. And I resonated with all those critiques so much. But, and this is really important, I also loved his posture throughout. He's kind of this, I read it as like a truly healthy, vibrant, prophetic posture in that he has a lot of fuel for what could be considered righteous anger. And I didn't get any sort of vitriol or anger or polemic from this book. I just got a very confident, very poised prophetic critique, posture of prophetic critique. And I thought it was so well done and so helpful and resonated with me so much. And I read it so fast. I think because of the nature of the writing and because of my personal resonance with a lot of stuff he's talking about, I just like gulped it down. And I'm actually going to try to revisit it and go through it a little bit more slowly to kind of receive more of what he talks about. But I just found this to be a remarkable book. And I would highly, highly recommend it. If you're a fan of Russell Moore or not, or even if you don't even know who he is, but if you, again, this may be a theme in a lot of my reading, if you're wrestling with your place in the American religious landscape, if you're not sure if you're evangelical or ex-evangelical or whatever, I think that you'd really, really appreciate Russell Moore's kind of public lament and call for the movement to be better. So that's Losing Our Religion. One more culture book I want to talk about. This is probably one of the more heavy, more academic, maybe more difficult to read, potentially books on my whole list here, and that is The Bulwarks of Unbelief by Joseph Minich, I'm not sure how to pronounce the last name, on divine absence in a secular age. Man, oh man, I loved this book too. This is one of my favorite kind of books of cultural study in a long time. And I was not familiar with him as a writer before. He has not done that much yet. I'm excited to see what else he does based on how much I really loved this book. But this is, there's too much going on in this book for me to summarize it in just a sentence. But he is talking about the title, first of all, is a twist and a play on a phrase from Charles Taylor, which if you follow my videos at all, you know I'm a big fan of Charles Taylor. But Charles Taylor talks about the bulwarks of belief, which is something that existed historically 500-ish years ago in his argument, in that the cultural, kind of social cultural fabric that Westerners at least lived in 500 years ago had all these unseen, invisible bulwarks that basically held up belief in the divine. Your average person, almost no average person was an atheist 500 years ago. And that's partly because of the bulwarks of belief that Charles Taylor argues existed at that time. Well, Joseph Minich is talking about the inverse. What are the bulwarks of unbelief in our culture? So what are the things, your average person, a lot of average people in the West no longer believe in God or find belief in God. At minimum, they find belief in God to be contested and difficult and fragile. That's such a starkly different kind of landscape than 5-6 centuries ago. And Joseph Minich talks a lot about why is that the case, essentially, what's going on there. And there's so much I loved about his analysis. There's so much I loved. And one more thing I want to say about it is I loved his conversation, his back and forth with Marx, actually. He seems to be of a pretty conservative kind of bent, politically, culturally, historically, whatever. I know that's a little bit of a loaded kind of label, and I don't want to label him too strictly with that. But my point is that someone with kind of that would resonate with his maybe more conservative approach to the world, the fact that he has such good dialogue with Marx and Marx's material in this book, and leverages Marx to great, I think, descriptive ends. I thought it was so helpful, so refreshing to see someone like him thoughtfully engage with Marx's actual kind of philosophical substructure and substrate to his thought. He engages with it so well and so fruitfully that I just found it extraordinarily helpful. He also has an account of kind of how did belief and function in the ancient world as in terms of holding back chaos, preserving order in the city center and around the temple. There's all this stuff that he talks about and then compares to our current reality. And I just think he puts forward some extremely, extremely thought-provoking and very helpful descriptive analysis in the bulwarks of unbelief. And I would, especially because this one I think seems to be a little bit more under the radar than a lot of other books I've talked about, I would highly, highly, highly commend it if you're willing to do a little bit of kind of some academic reading and maybe some slower, more dense work to get through this book. It's highly worth it. All right. Finally, I want to get to my book of the year, which is a book I reviewed, another author I interviewed, so this may not be a surprise, but actually, yeah, it's on my shelf. I just caught it out of the corner of my eye. But that is my book of the year for 2023 is The Scandal of Leadership by J.R. Woodward. Man, I could talk about this book for a long, long time. I won't. But I really loved this book for so many reasons. One of the reasons it's my book of the year is because I actually tend to not like, or at least have a complicated relationship with leadership books or books in that kind of subgenre. And this one blew me away. It totally undid any of my resistance to the idea of a leadership book. It's also a constructive project in that he builds a theology of leadership in the church. He also builds a theology of the principalities and powers, which is also not something that I was necessarily thinking that much about when I picked it up. He leverages to amazing effect the work of people like Walter Wink and Rene Girard and William Stringfellow and Oscar Romero. And I just thought that his depth of engagement with all those sources was remarkable. The writing is so clear and the summaries are so helpful, but they don't sacrifice any depth. Like, you get a really, really good overview of Girard's thought, for example, on mimetic theory and mimetic rivalry. He also puts forward something else I keep thinking about since I read this book is his engagement with Matthew Croasman on emergent science, and ways that idea interacts with the theology of the principalities and powers. So helpful, such another lightning bolt for me this year when I'm thinking about books that have impacted me the most in my thinking. And then all of it comes together as a really, really compelling, remarkable understanding of how healthy leadership should look in the church. How should a leader, Christian leader, a ministry leader, lead in resistance to the principalities and powers with an awareness of how they function to distort one's leadership? How should that look instead? And what does it look like if you give in to the distorting effects of the principalities and powers on your leadership? What's that going to do? What are the destructive impact it has on a community that will then become consumed by mimetic rivalry, for example? Gosh, there's just so much here that is so worth thinking about, meditating on, unpacking, revisiting. It's my book of the year for lots of reasons. It's enjoyable to read. It's depth of scholarship. Its comprehensive approach to the material that it's putting together. The fact that it's a leadership book that is so good and so kind of a counter witness to so many other leadership books. It's doing something utterly different that's theologically compelling, deeply resourced, very persuasive, and honestly pretty life-changing if you really, really, really let it sink into you. So yeah, that's my book of the year. So congratulations, I guess, to J.R. Woodward and to the Scandal of Leadership for winning that prize on my humble little corner of the internet here. But yeah, when I was thinking about what books to put together in this list, that one was kind of a no-brainer. I didn't even have to really think that hard about it. It was an easy pick for me. So there you go. Those are my book awards for 2023, according to my tastes, my reading experiences of the year. And I hope that this list gave you something that you might want to check out, something you might want to discover, some new titles, some new writers that you might be into, especially if you're interested in history, theology, culture, all of that stuff that I particularly love. But as always, thanks for taking some time to watch.